Hey everyone, welcome back to Geet Builds. I'm Geet, and lately, I've been having a tough time trying to settle on what the next project on this channel is going to be. I've struggled with creative block in the past, but this definitely feels like the worst case of it that I've had. After finishing the Keysaw build, I've just felt really creatively stopped up. I'll start to get an idea for something, I'll put together a map, and I'll work on it a little bit, and then it feels like my inspiration just totally collapses in on itself. So to avoid making a decision on what my next project will be, today I'll just be making 5 different castles, each with their own unique style. And hopefully, along the way, I can inspire you in your own building adventures. The castles range in difficulty, from ones that are survival friendly, to castles so big and detailed that you're definitely going to want to be creative if you're going to build something similar, so there's a little something for everyone. And hopefully, by the end of the video, I'll have moved past the creative block and I'll be able to settle on my next project. Alright, so let's get into the first castle. The Valley Castle. Before you begin a build, it's important to consider the terrain you'll be working with. I'll be building the first castle at the opening of the valley, spanning across from one side to the other and going over the river. Since the sides of the valley are a lot higher than the low point of the river, I know that this build's going to need to be pretty tall, so I'll need to keep that in mind when I'm thinking about what the overall design is going to look like. I started out by dividing the castle up into segments reaching from one side of the build to the other, just to get a measure of how much space I'd be working with. For this castle, I wanted the level of detailing to be pretty low, and to make the build interesting by mostly using color and depth. On the grey stone parts of the castle, I used mossy blocks towards the bottom, and gradually I worked my way up through regular stone bricks and up to andesite blocks at the top. For contrast, I went with a reddish color scheme on the deeper sections of the walls. This starts with mud bricks towards the bottom, and then goes through brick and then granite at the top. The gate that goes over the water is also super easy to make, and just uses fences and chains. On top of the wall, I built a covered wooden walkway. I used stripped spruce logs for the walls and different deep slate blocks for the roof, going from dark to light. You could just use one kind of block to make it even easier for survival. I made the windows using trapdoors, but if you find working with trapdoors annoying, you could use glass instead, or just leave the windows uncovered entirely. This is a build that can definitely be done in survival. It's a decent size, but for the most part it's a pretty flat castle and the blocks are easy to get. To make it even easier, you could skip doing the gradients and just go with stone bricks for the gray parts and your choice of either granite or brick for the red sections. The main keep of the castle is pretty simple and just continues some of the themes I was working with through the rest of the build. To make the overall shape more interesting, in the middle sections of the circular walls, I pushed the walls out by 1 block and then brought it back in towards the top. If you look close, you can see that I also used wall blocks to make the circle towers look more rounded. That's something I like to do when I'm making circular builds, but it isn't necessary to do. So with the first castle done, I think now's a good time to do a pro-con list for this build. I think one of the biggest pros for this castle is its simplicity. If you're newer to building, then this would be a pretty good project to take on, since the shapes of the different towers and walls are easy to make. Another pro for this build is that the blocks themselves are easy to get, especially if you're not doing the gradients, so you could recreate this in survival without too much trouble. And for the cons for this build. As for the castle's aesthetic, I don't think it's the most unique design ever. It's really just a European castle that's more long than it is wide. It looks good, but it's not really breaking new ground as far as Minecraft castles go. It's also a little bit terrain dependent. You definitely need some hilly terrain to make this castle look good, and it would be pretty strange seeing this castle in a flat open field. So you're either going to need to do some terraforming yourself, or just get really lucky with finding a suitable place to build it in Minecraft. This castle's pretty big, which I think can be both a pro and a con. If you're looking for a big project to spend a lot of time working towards, then this fits the bill. But if you want something that you can rush through and do in an hour or two, then this probably isn't the castle for you. But if that's the case, then later on in this video, there's a castle that might be more your speed. And now it's time to move on to a very different and much more unique build. Castle 2, the Orc Fortress. This build is one of the most unique styles I've worked with. There's just not a lot of Minecraft content out there built in an orcish style. JRCraft has a really cool orc city from a couple years ago, but beyond that, there's not really any projects that I know of that have worked in this aesthetic. So for the style I'd be creating, I used Warhammer Age of Reckoning concept art to get a sense for what I wanted the fortress to look like. So if you also want to do an orc themed build, that might be a good place for you to start as well. There's not a ton out there, but anything's better than nothing. The trickiest part for this style is that it needs to look chaotic and thrown together without much skill, but in Minecraft, that can quickly turn into a noisy build that lacks discernible features. In my opinion, it's a thin line between intentionally chaotic and just messy, and I try to avoid crossing it. I used fences and wall blocks as supports, which gives the impression that the fort is thrown together haphazardly. I also used those blocks at the top of the walls, sticking out to look like spikes, which was a distinctive part of the concept art that I really liked. In real life, making buildings more than a couple stories tall requires decent engineering, which doesn't seem like a career path many orcs would choose. So I'm keeping the walls and towers shorter than normal, and their highest point is a lot lower than the valley castle. The walkways on the tops of the walls are made of trapdoors and fences to give the castle that spindly look. And the gatehouse also has a wooden mishmash of logs and fences with spikes on top that look hastily nailed together. For the color palette, I used mud bricks and packed mud for the walls, and then I used mangrove blocks and fences for accents. The walkways were made using a variety of spruce blocks, like trapdoors, slabs, and stairs. This felt like a really unique group of blocks to use together. It has a very muted, earthy tone, and I'm not sure I've seen it done before. I think the Orc Fort looks really good in this biome, but would feel even more at home if it were placed in a desert or a Badlands biome. The brown color of the rocks and grass in the Badlands biome blends way better with the Orc Fortress than a regular plains or forest biome, so keep that in mind if you're doing a similar color scheme on your own build. I'd say that this build falls into a similar difficulty as the Valley Castle. Once you get the style down, it's not too hard to work with, and none of the blocks are too crazy to get. For the most part, if you can find a mangrove swamp, then you've got pretty much all the blocks you need to make this. The only other blocks you need in abundance are spruce, which are also super common, and dripstone for some of the spikes. Working with this many trapdoors and fences can definitely be annoying, but if you really hate it, you could leave out a lot of the extra fences, and you could use slabs instead of trapdoors. But I still wouldn't use full blocks for the floors, because I think it's important for the walkways to have a thin look to them so that the fort seems poorly put together. For the pros of this build, I'd say uniqueness is a huge pro for the Orc Fortress. The style of the build is really different than most castles you see in Minecraft, and same for the colors too. And like I just talked about, I'd give the Orc Fortress the survival friendly label. You just might want to adjust the style if some of the blocks seem annoying to work with. The build being short also helps for doing it in survival. Finally, I'd say this is a terrain independent style. You can see here that I've built it on a slight slope, but you could make something similar on top of a hill or on a completely flat area, and it would still look totally fine, so you don't really have to do any terraforming to make this work. For the cons of the Orc Fortress, I'd say that the biggest is that the style is difficult to pick up at first because it's such a weird aesthetic. So getting a feel for it could take a second, especially if you're going to be doing something more than just the fort, and you're building something like a whole orc city. A con towards doing it in survival is that these aren't really blocks that you're going to pick up naturally, like you would with normal stone blocks by mining. You would need to seek out a mangrove swamp and take some time grinding for all the blocks you'd need. It's not that bad, but just a little inconvenient. Beyond that, I don't really have a third con. The style was really fun to work with, and if you're looking for a unique style you haven't built before, I'd definitely recommend giving this a try. And with the Orc Fortress done, let's move on to the third castle. Castle 3, the Japanese castle. I've made a few castles in my time as a builder, but they've typically been in a European or Gothic style. So much like the Orc Castle, building a Japanese castle was going to be a learning experience for me. Since I wasn't familiar with this kind of style, I did a little research on Japanese castles, and found that they're usually comprised of a main defensible castle tower, surrounded by a system of low walls and moats, with occasional smaller towers along the walls and a separate palace for living quarters. I'd chosen to make my Japanese castle on top of the mountain, which meant I wasn't going to be able to include a moat, but everything else was good to go. To get a better grasp on how this architectural style translated to Minecraft, I did some snooping around other builders' projects to see what they do. My favorite creator that I found was a YouTuber called Six Wings, who's got some really excellent videos where he builds Japanese-inspired castles. My first impression of Japanese castle architecture is that it's very geometric and orderly. There's lots of straight, flat walls and 90-degree corners, so going into this I was confident that this style would be pretty easy to pick up. This was not correct. There's lots of complex depth, namely tile roofs and balconies, that extends way out from the walls, and every piece of the build needs to fit together in a very specific way to keep up its orderly appearance. It sort of feels like you're designing a 3D puzzle at the same time that you're putting it together for the first time, if that makes sense. It's easier to see what I mean if we zoom in a little. Every tier of the tower is a bit smaller, and has an ornate tile roof extending out to cover the balcony below it. These roofs also have a detailed wooden underside supporting them. I found it was easiest to build the wooden sections first so I would know how wide the roof would be, and then build the tiled parts on top. The corners of the tile roof slope up to meet in a point, and so I would make those and then connect the wooden sections beneath them. I'm gonna go ahead and talk a bit about the materials I decided to use. In order to replicate the smooth white plaster look a lot of Japanese castles have, I used white terracotta. It's not as bright as calcite or white concrete, so it's a good texture for plaster. Something I found interesting is that it seems like a lot of the remaining Japanese castles are built in a black and white color scheme, but a majority of art depicting Japanese castles features bright red accents. I'm not sure why that's the case, but I like that color palette, so I used different mangrove blocks for the red sections. For all the brown wood colors mixed in, I of course used spruce blocks. Oak is just too bright, and dark oak is too dark, so spruce is a solid middle ground. I went with 2 different color schemes for the tile roofs. Again, most remaining castles seem to have black tiles, while lots of art uses a tealish green. I used both to mix things up, and prevent the towers from blending in too much. For the black roofs, I tried both black stone and deep slate, and in the end went with deep slate because it has more of an ashy color compared to black stone, which had too deep of a black color to it. For the green ones, I went with oxidized copper. Because I thought this style was going to be a lot easier to build in, I didn't put aside enough time for this castle, and ended up having to do a lot of copy pasting. So if you're interested in building in a Japanese style, that might be something you want to consider. In Japanese castle architecture, there's a tendency to have wooden batten panels that cover the lower half, or in some cases, even entire sections of walls. To mimic this, I've used fences on the outside of the walls, but you could also use trapdoors for this, or even just 2 separate colored blocks. In Minecraft, detailing is a tough balance to strike, with some styles looking better with minimal detailing, and others looking good with lots of texture and depth. In my opinion, this is definitely the latter, and the more detail you can fit in, the more realistic the style appears, so definitely go crazy with the detailing. And I've gone over my time budget for this build, so I'm gonna speed through the pro-cons a bit quick for this one. One pro is that this style translates surprisingly well to Minecraft. It was nice being able to pack in tons of detail into a build without it being over-detailed. But that's kind of a double-edged sword, since I think if you didn't detail enough, then the build would look bland and flat. A second point towards this style is that it's a bit underutilized, so you can definitely make your builds stand out compared to the normal medieval European builds. For the final pro, I'd say this is a good style for improving your overall skills as a builder. A lot of the techniques you're required to use to make the Japanese style look good are things that you can use to take other kinds of builds to the next level. To the cons again, this is not a survival friendly style. It's just really complex and you need a lot of different blocks. Now obviously you can if you're really determined, but it just seems like a major pain to me. And finally, this style is hard. I'd say that the skill floor and ceiling for this style are both pretty high, so if you're really new to building, then you might get a bit tripped up. And with all that said, let's move on to the 4th castle, which is going to be the easiest and most survival friendly of the bunch. Castle 4, the generic survival castle. Building in survival takes forever, and so much longer than in creative. So if you're looking for a castle to do in survival, then there's a chance that the past 3 castles might be bigger than what you'd want to make in your own world. Grinding for all the materials can be annoying and time consuming. So with this next build, I'm keeping the scale small and materials pretty simple, and I'm going to try to use only blocks that are easy to get or make in survival. I'm also going to focus on giving the castle a more interesting shape, since that's not something you specifically need creative for. I went with circular towers that slope in as you go up, with a lot of varied heights to make the castle feel more organic. Whenever I see someone post on Reddit asking for help and saying that their build feels boring, the first thing I usually notice is whether they have one uniform height throughout the build. Breaking up your ceilings and walkways to create different levels is a quick way to make your build interesting, so try to keep that in mind. For the most part, I've left the walls bare, without tons of decorative blocks on them to keep things simple, but I did use a gradient. If you don't do a gradient on the walls, the build might look flat, but it would make it a lot easier. I used deep slate bricks towards the bottom, then dead coral blocks and cobblestone above that, finishing up with stone bricks at the top of the walls. The floors are just spruce planks, with lines of sideways barrels every so often to give the impression that the floor has rivets securing it to a supporting beam. For some final touches, I turned the diagonal wall into a gatehouse with a drawbridge. And then I went through the rest of the castle, adding huge banners hanging down from walls and flagpoles. Trapdoors are really good for this because they're thin, and unlike the banner items, they don't unrender after you move too far away, so they'll still show up even when you're far outside the castle. I used the mangrove variant for my build because I thought the red color matched best, but you could also use warped or crimson wood trapdoors since those are also colorful. A big strength of a build like this is that it's a quick project. I've got a lot of practice, and I'm using World Edit, so I'm working at a pretty good pace, but this still only took me about 2 hours and 45 minutes. So if you're not wanting to commit to a build that's going to take up weeks of your time, then a castle like this is a solid alternative to the ones from earlier. But because of that, it's not the most striking castle ever, and you can definitely see a lot of similar builds on Reddit or Instagram, so I'd say it's definitely the most generic castle on the list. The build is definitely survival friendly, both with the materials used and the size and shape of the castle. It's a pretty squat build, so you're not going to need to worry about getting up super high using scaffolding or anything like that, so that's also going to make it easier. And finally, you can build a castle like this pretty much anywhere and it would look good. So if you're in a really mountainous biome, it'll look good, or if it's in a completely flat plains biome, it'll still look like it belongs there. And since the overall area the build takes up isn't very big, you're not going to have to do much terraforming to make it fit. And that's pretty much it for this castle. I don't really have any other cons beyond it just being a pretty generic build, which honestly might not actually be that much of a con for a lot of people. As a content creator, I feel like I need to make my builds unique, but if you're not a content creator, then that probably doesn't matter as much. So as a whole, the build is pretty simple, you can do it quickly, and I don't think that any of the cons from earlier castles apply to this one. And with 4 castles down, we're going to go ahead and move on to the 5th and final castle, which isn't quite a normal castle, but it is something I get asked to make all the time in my comments. Castle 5, the Dwarven Stronghold. Dwarven builds are tough in Minecraft, since they kind of need to be underground to be a classical Dwarven build, and underground lighting in Minecraft is just awful. But lucky enough, one of the most iconic parts of Dwarven architecture are the gates leading into their underground cities, which are above ground, which means that when you build them in Minecraft, they can have good lighting. Dwarven architecture usually consists of a very Art Deco aesthetic, with repeating geometric patterns and lots of symmetry. This makes it easy to create a Dwarven style in Minecraft, since Minecraft's blocky textures fit naturally into geometric designs. A tip I have for this style is to avoid cramming too much detail into it. Try to take a step back and think about how the design will look when viewed from afar. A lot of packed-in detail can make it hard to distinguish the geometric patterns you're trying to create. You can see that I've mostly used large, repeating patterns that on their own are pretty simple, but when viewed from afar, altogether have a very strong and stylized look. I'd say with the addition of all the new types of stone blocks, it's a better time than ever to make a Dwarven build in Minecraft. One thing I really disliked about my last attempt to make a Dwarven build is that everything blended together, because the only stone blocks I had available were some variation of light gray. But now, with blocks like deep slate, tuff, and mud bricks added, there's a ton more texture options available to make different parts of your build stand out from the stone it's built into. So make sure to utilize color in your own build if you decide to take on a Dwarven project. A big strength of this style is how much fun it is to work with, and a lot of that is because of how free you are to make your own rules. There are some loose ideas you sort of have to work with, but because it's a fantasy style, you can really make your own aesthetic with it, which to me is a super enjoyable thing to do. But this style is not survival friendly, which means that if you're someone who's really into doing everything in survival, then I wouldn't recommend doing a Dwarven build. They require a lot of vertical work, and they're almost always built at a huge scale to get that grand Dwarven feel. And more so than most styles, I feel like if you just Google Minecraft Dwarven builds, it's a lot easier to tell which were made in survival and which ones had all the tools and resources available in creative to work with. This sort of leads me into the next con, and that's that Dwarven builds are pretty much by design terraforming simulators, to an extent that I'd recommend not only making a Dwarven build exclusively in creative, but on top of that, I'd say that mods that make terraforming easier are almost a requirement. World Edit can help, but I think something more advanced like Archeon or Voxelsniper would be best. As I mentioned earlier, the Dwarven style fits really well into Minecraft because of how geometric it tends to be, which the blocky nature of Minecraft does really well with. Trying to make blocks into curves can be tough, and you can largely ignore that if you want in this aesthetic, and just go for hard edges and rough angles, and it totally fits in with the style. And that's going to be it for this video. The map that all these castles are built on will be posted on Planet Minecraft for download, and you can find the link to that in the description. I'll also be posting a buildless version of this map to my Patreon. I've got a ton of content over there, like buildless versions of all my maps, as well as schematics you can use in your own worlds. 4K renders of maps for wallpapers, and tons of world planner stuff, like project files and brushes for you to download. You'll also get your name to scroll by at the end of my videos. So I hope this video helped you either come up with your own idea for a build, or that you were inspired by something in this and able to get past a creative block. Or at the very least, maybe just seeing a time-lapse of 5 different castles was fun. So I hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll see you next time. Peace.